Welcome back to the Florida History Podcast. I'm Curtis Krishnaiyer. I'm flying solo this week. Robert Buccellato will be back next week to finally have, I believe, finally have our long delayed episode on Fuller Warren, one of the most colorful and controversial figures to ever serve as governor of the state of Florida. We've been overcome by events here at the Florida Squeeze with between Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Milton, and of course, the 2024 election. So let's talk today a little bit about the 2004 elections in Florida and how they were impacted by an epic hurricane season in 2004. We had another similar hurricane season the following year in 2005, but that was not an election year. So 2004, much more significant to talk about. So when looking at 2004, you have to note that Florida had not faced a direct hit from a major hurricane or a powerful hurricane since 1999. Actually, that was not a major hurricane. That was Hurricane Irene. Not the Irene that struck the Northeast in 2011, but a weaker Hurricane Eileen. That was a Cat 1 storm that dumped a ton of rain over the southern part of the peninsula. But there had been threats in '99 from Hurricane Floyd, which turned, even though there was varying model interpretations, and actually Southeast Florida, or I think everything from Brevard County south, was put under a hurricane warning at one point, and some other threats. But the 90s had been a rough decade, right? 92, you had Hurricane Andrew, and in 1995, you had Hurricane Opal strike the Panhandle. And also 1998's Hurricane Georges, which hit the Keys, but was forecast to make more direct impacts on the peninsula than it actually did. So between two major hurricanes in the 90s on opposite ends of the state, and then because obviously Andrew was Southeast Florida, Homestead in particular, and the storms of 98 and 99, where a lot of the state was under the gun, there was a kind of a weariness. We come into the 2000s, we have a couple tropical storms, a couple threats, but nothing really until 2004. But what a season 2004 was. And it shattered a lot of myths, right? One of the myths was you can go to Orlando to avoid hurricanes. Well, if you went to Orlando in 2004, you got hit 3 times by storms of hurricane strength. The first of these storms was Hurricane Charlie, which in August of 2004, was supposed to strike the Tampa Bay area. And there was one meteorologist in the Tampa Bay area, Dennis Phillips of Action News, the ABC station in Tampa, St. Pete, who said, you know what, this storm could turn into Southwest Florida. And at the time, the public didn't have as much access to model data and that sort of thing that we do today, but we did have access to more information than we did during Hurricane Andrew just 12 years earlier. So Phillips makes this prediction, and I'm looking at the storm personally. I'm thinking, yeah, that's really quite plausible. And it did. It slammed into Punta Gorda, wiped out large parts of Charlotte County, went right up the state through Arcadia, where it did a lot of damage. It made landfall as a Cat 4 storm. Went right through Arcadia, right through Bartow, and the eye went over significant portions of the Orlando metropolitan area and brought hurricane force winds to significant portions of the Orlando metropolitan area. In fact, those people who had evacuated from Tampa and had gone to Orlando, or had evacuated from St. Petersburg and had gone to Orlando, got caught in a storm which gave relatively minor effects to the Tampa Bay area. So that was really a hurricane lesson. Immediately after the storm, Jeb Bush is on the ground, and he's doing what appears to be a very competent job when compared to the past in Florida. 92, Andrew was a debacle, both for his father, President Bush, and for the Governor Lawton Chiles, who was a Democrat, of course, and Governor Childs at that point had the lowest approval rating ever recorded for a Florida governor, right after Andrew. So as much as many of our listeners and your host personally revere Senator and Governor Childs, Andrew was not his finest moment. At least it was not perceived as his finest moment by the general public in the state of Florida. So Bush's approval begins to rise, and keep in mind his brother, George W. Bush, is running for re-election as president of the United States. We could argue about the 2000 election, that result, but he had been put in office and had served his first term, and was up for re-election and was facing the Democratic nominee, John Kerry. So that's August. In September, we have a partisan primary on both the Republican and Democratic sides. The Democrats nominate Betty Castor to run for U.S. Senate for the seat being vacated by the great Bob Graham. She defeats Peter Deutsch and Alex Pinellas in the primary. You go over to the Republican side, you have a very contentious primary between Mel Martinez and Bill McCollum. Bill McCollum having run for U.S. Senate in 2000 and having served in the U.S. House for 20 years, from 1980 to 2000. He was from Seminole County. And Mel Martinez was from Orange County, so, close neighbors. Really contentious primary. Charlie's aftermath did not impact turnout, but the fear of Hurricane Francis, which at that time was a Category 4 storm barreling towards the southeast coast of Florida and almost certain to come across at hurricane strength and impact the west coast of Florida, did impact turnout. Now, what ended up happening is the primary was on a Tuesday, as it always is, and then you had several days of hurricane warnings and preps in southern Florida, or all the way up to Volusia, Flagler County, that area, and a storm that then basically stalled over the Bahamas, went from a strong Cat 4 on the cusp of Cat 5 status to a Cat 2 when it made landfall in Martin County on Saturday. And this was from Thursday to Saturday. It kind of sat and moved at 2-3 miles per hour. Kind of reminiscent of what Hurricane Dorian would do many years later to the Bahamas. Really devastating event for the Bahamas. But during that entire time, it was interacting with Florida, and with Southeast Florida in particular, which is a very Democratic area, as everybody knows. So there were 3 days of impacts if you were in Broward, Palm Beach, Martin, St. Lucie, and Indian River counties. 3 days of impacts. And so Jeb Bush adroitly understands this. Storm comes right across Orlando again, like Charlie had a few weeks earlier, gets back into the Gulf and makes a second landfall in the Panhandle. And in fact, caused some fatalities in the Tallahassee area. So, although it made a second landfall as a tropical storm, right? It had weakened that substantially. But devastating storm. Bush understands the impact of this. We have a big football game in the state of Florida, Miami and Florida State, in the ACC opener for 2004, scheduled for Labor Day night. That game is moved by ABC to, who was broadcasting the game, to a Friday night. Was originally going to be moved up a week. And then suddenly Hurricane Ivan, which is in the South Caribbean, is thought to be making a beeline for South Florida. So the game is moved to Friday instead of to the following Monday or even the following Saturday because, my goodness, they're going to be under the gun again in Southeast Florida. Now, as it turns out, Ivan's path meandered a bit to the west, which took it into the Gulf of Mexico. It makes a landfall in Gulf Shores, Alabama. But the greatest impacts are east of the center, the northeast quadrant of the storm. Ivan makes landfall as a major hurricane. On September 16th. And the impacts in Florida are far worse than they are in Alabama. In fact, the bridge over Escambia Bay on I-10 collapsed during the weight of the storm surge and the winds. So all kinds of damage in the Pensacola area. That's a very Republican area, but Bush does a very good job, very visible job. So I'm involved in the campaigns that year, and I go up to Indian River County a little bit after the landfall event of Ivan. And in Indian River County, I'm told, you know what? Just the last 2 weeks have all been about Hurricane Francis and the damage it did. Now we can get back to campaigning. Same thing I hear when I drive a little further north into Brevard and talk to Democratic candidates, right? I was working for Democrats exclusively back then. And what happens is then a couple of days later, Ivan comes back as a remnant low and makes a second landfall in southeast Florida, right? Somewhere in Broward County, Palm Beach County, dumps a ton of rain on the peninsula and then comes back into the Gulf of Mexico, reforms as a tropical system and makes a landfall in Texas. So that kind of messes things up again, but it's a remnant low. It's just a lot of rain. Okay, back to the campaign. Then Hurricane Jeanne, which was looking like it was heading north towards the Carolinas, makes a loop and comes back towards southeast Florida. Now, it was Tropical Storm Jeanne at the time. It intensifies, makes landfall around Sewell's Point, Martin County, same place that, or very close, like I think within about 3 miles of where Francis had made landfall. Although Francis took a very different angle, right? It came on that angle through the Bahamas and just brought an awful storm surge and impacts, which Jeanne was just this kind of fast-moving major hurricane, but most of the impacts, because of the angle it hit the coast on, were wind damage and rain. Goes right through Orlando again and then out of the state. That made landfall on September 26th. So again, Jeb Bush is in the spotlight. He's down in South Florida. He's leading the relief efforts. He's in Orange County. He's not like Ron DeSantis was in 2022 with Ian, where DeSantis very clearly felt like Lee County and DeSoto County, which had voted for him in 2018, were more worthy of attention than Orange County, who had voted for his opponent, Andrew Gillum, and would vote for Charlie Crist a month later. Charlie Crist being a Democrat, obviously by 2022. We're talking about 2004, when Charlie Crist was our Republican Attorney General, right? This is before he switched parties. Bush, is going to very Democratic areas, and it's reflecting really well on his brother, President George W. Bush, who would have his own problems the next year, right, with Hurricane Katrina. But at this time, it didn't show up. And I think to this day, Jeb Bush's very visible and public efforts at relief between August 13th, when Charlie made landfall, and late September in the aftermath of Hurricane Jeanne. That's a good 6 weeks where he was constantly in the news. He was constantly looking like he was giving a helping hand, constantly looking like governing was very competent from the Bush family, which is not something I think has been the view in the wake of other storms, right? I mentioned 92 and Andrew, and that reflected very poorly on his father and very poorly on Governor Lawton Chiles. I would make that argument about some of what we've seen after hurricanes since. Obviously, infamously 2005 and Katrina, right? But similarly, I think that there were some debacles during Rita in 2005, debacles during Hurricane Ike in 2008 in Texas. I mean, a lot of people got killed in the evacuation because it was so poorly coordinated by the state of Texas in that case, and their governor, Rick Perry. And more recently in Florida, I have, there are some critiques of Rick Scott. I think in general he did pretty well with storms, but I have some very significant critiques of Ron DeSantis and his governing competence. It has nothing to do with political ideology, but just governing competence in and around and after, before, around, and after major hurricanes. So I do think, although one thing I do have to give DeSantis credit for is I think he's been very good at getting the power companies to move quickly to restore power, which wasn't necessarily the case under Bush, right? I mean, infamously, Southeast Florida, there were parts of Southeast Florida that didn't have power for a month after Hurricane Wilma in 2005. But remember, we're talking about 2004, and we're talking about how it affected the election. So what happened in 2005? George W. Bush is already is already in a second term then, so mattered a little less in terms of the politics. This, I think, was directly responsible for Florida, which was thought to be probably the closest state in the 2004 election, and a lot of people thought would decide the election in 2004, being a state George W. Bush won by 5 points, which is the outlier election in Florida between 1992 and 2020, right? Even in 2020, Trump won Florida by 3.5 points, which was a lot compared to the national trends. But that's less than Bush won it by in 2004. Betty Castor loses to Mel Martinez in that U.S. Senate race by a matter of what would become a very familiar margin for Florida Democrats, by a matter of 5 figures, 49-48. That would be how Rick Scott would win 3 elections subsequently. That would be how Ron DeSantis would beat Andrew Gillum in 2018. Like I said, Scott beat Alex Sink in 2010 and Charlie Crist, who by that time had switched parties and was the Democratic nominee for governor by a percentage point in 2014. That 49-48 would become very familiar for Democrats. After the storm, I remember doing the debriefings, and really felt like Martinez in that Senate race had benefited directly from Jeb Bush's apparent competence and apparent caring, and the staging of all of the FEMA sites around hurricane-hit areas, the staging of state relief emergency management sites around hurricane-hit areas, and the kind of warp speed this went on with, which is, again, another criticism of DeSantis, because there's been a lag, and there's been kind of, look, I mean, DeSantis has surrounded himself with a lot of people who are not from Florida. Rick Scott, we can say, wasn't from Florida himself, but he had Floridians around him, right? And he, for whatever you think of him ideologically and his history in Columbia HTA and Medicare fraud and that sort of thing, those things, I mean, he was pretty competent as an administrator. So Bush was competent. He appeared competent as an administrator. We would learn after Wilma, maybe not so much so, but that was a year later, more than a year later. And he did very well with Ivan. He did very well with Charlie, Francis, and Gene. I think it represents the difference in the 2004 Senate race and that seat flipping to the Republicans. The Democrats haven't won back since. And Mel Martinez winning that election. And then I think it made a big difference in the state. I think Bush probably still wins Florida, George W. Bush, but he wins it by that margin of 5, which was the biggest margin a candidate from either party. I guess matching the 96 Clinton margin in Florida, but the 96 Clinton margin in Florida was less than Clinton's national margin, right, in terms of popular vote. He won Florida by 5 points. He won nationally by 8 or 9, close to 9 points. In 2004, Bush won Florida by 5 points. He won nationally by about a point. So the hurricanes and the relief did make a difference in the way Jeb Bush appeared in those storms. So anyway, I wanted to give you that. Thank you for listening. We will be back next week with another Florida history podcast. This is going to be the episode on Fuller Warren, unless we get hit by another storm, which is not likely based on the models. It's almost impossible. There have been rumors of a Nadine out there that was going to hit Florida. That's fake news, by the way. But it's that time of the year. You never know what can happen. But 99% chance, or 95% chance we're doing Fuller Warren next week. Thank you for listening.